It was a beautiful day in the fall, and although being in the middle of nowhere in Ohio is not exactly my ideal setting for an assignment, it could have been worse. Opening my windows, listening to music, and taking in a deep breath of country air is a refreshing contrast to being cooped up in the cities I'm used to. The sight of the brown stalks of corn stretching across miles of fields along the road was a welcome sight, as was the cool, clean smell of the air. It's a good thing these jobs don't require much interaction with people. Unfortunately, some level of interaction is inevitable. On my way to this one, I got a speeding ticket from a cop at some small local department. Though I was, in fact, speeding, I had the feeling that he also didn't much like seeing a federal agent in his neck of the woods. The local police aren't particularly fond of us, I've come to learn. They tend to get suspicious, thinking we're involved in some top-secret mission behind their backs. I guess they would be right. I kept driving down the gravel road until the navigation let me know my destination was approaching on the right. Turning down the radio as I neared, I glanced toward the empty fields and the woods that met them in the distance. I then turned onto the long dirt driveway leading to the civilian's house and garage. I rolled up and parked, my trunk facing the porch. Stepping out, I took in another whiff of the fresh country air and surveyed the area of operations before me. I was surprised by the amount of land and space available to me. Space is crucial for these kinds of jobs. Furthermore, I had been told that there were no neighbors close enough to be a concern. I couldn't have asked for a better setting. After stretching and letting out a light sigh, I decided it was time to get to work. I pulled the keychain from my pocket and unlocked the front door. It seemed like a nice enough place. Certainly nothing to complain about, especially compared to the conditions of some houses I've dealt with during previous assignments. I went back outside to my large government-issued vehicle and opened the trunk. I grabbed the first few duffel bags filled with equipment and brought them inside. The kitchen seemed like as good a place as any to set up. After making 5 or 6 trips, dragging heavy bags and boxes of my gear into the house, I went back outside to open the garage. Thank God we managed to catch this case early, and the civilians were able to evacuate in time. This also meant I had room in the garage to park the vehicle. The only thing left in the truck was a large metallic box, but I wasn't going to need that until later. I shut the trunk and drove my vehicle into the garage, closing it behind me as I exited. Back inside, I changed from my suit into my gear. Wearing the suit all day annoys me, but I suppose the higher-ups want us to look like friendly, approachable federal agents to the public. The public has no idea what we're really like. I unpacked box after box of equipment and weapons. I loaded my Glock 17 with its extended 30-round magazine, just as I did with my standard .556 rifle. I checked the laser sights on both. All good. Next came my favorite, the .338 rifle, equipped with the best scope money can buy. It sure is nice having a virtually unlimited budget. Perks of working for the U.S. federal government, I suppose. The final firearm I brought was my personal .357 Magnum revolver, which I kept holstered on my chest. I figure it's never a bad idea to have one more gun, just in case. Maybe I should have brought more on this one. If things got too close, I always had my hunting knife. I had sharpened it that morning before heading out. The next few hours were spent walking out into the woods near the house, setting up dozens of little cameras equipped with motion sensors. These cameras were there to give me an early warning if anything dared to get close to the fields surrounding the house. I would know about it long before it reached me. I didn't take too many precautions when setting them up. Things never get interesting until nightfall. I returned to the house, turned on my laptop, and ensured that all the cameras were connected and working. I could see every single one of them from there and would be alerted if anything moved. I settled into a chair by the kitchen table, opened the window, and set up my .338 rifle to keep an eye on the fields. I suppose it's worth mentioning why I'm here, setting up high-tech equipment in the woods and loading up an arsenal of guns while I'm alone in a farmhouse that isn't mine. Let's rewind. On March 1st, 2017, at 3:33 a.m. in Iowa, dispatch received a call from a local farmer. He claimed to have spotted a figure standing motionless at the edge of the tree on his property. The farmer described the figure as a man of average height and build, wearing a loose black or gray shirt and trousers, along with a large-brimmed hat. The farmer told dispatch that he had woken abruptly roughly an hour earlier, though he didn't specify why. Soon after, he spotted the figure outside his kitchen window. The figure had been standing near the edge of a row of trees, facing the house, and had not moved a muscle since the farmer first noticed him. The farmer quickly retrieved his rifle and stepped out onto his lawn, proceeding to brandish his firearm and order the trespasser to leave, stating that the property was his. When the farmer saw that the man remained unbothered by his warning and display of the weapon, he retreated back into his home to retrieve his phone and call 911, all while continuing to watch the figure from his porch. During the call, the farmer's voice was noticeably nervous and frightened. The tone in his voice grew more desperate and shaky as he explained the situation to dispatch. Dispatch instructed the farmer to remain where he was and not approach the trespasser. They reassured him that the police were on their way. A few quiet and uneventful minutes passed. Then, without warning, the farmer let out a horrified scream through the phone. The call was disconnected just seconds later. The police began their over 40-minute drive to the residence. Halfway to their arrival, multiple new calls came into dispatch from the farmer's neighbors. They reported seeing a large column of smoke coming from the farmer's home, with the closest neighbor even reporting that the house appeared to be on fire. By the time the police arrived, the house had burned to the ground. The fire department arrived shortly after, but oddly enough, the fire had completely subsided. What remained were the charred remnants of what was once a house. The firefighters who arrived on the scene were bewildered by how quickly the fire must have burned through the house. There was no explanation they could provide. The police conducted a search of the nearby fields and woods for the farmer and the alleged trespasser, but found nothing. Their search was quickly called off upon the discovery made by the firefighters in the house. The man's charred bones were found beneath the rubble, but not as they should have been. It became clear after further investigation that the man's limbs had been ripped from his body before it was incinerated at an impossible speed. 4.308 bullet casings were found where the porch of the house used to be. The rifle was found just outside of the house, and scathed despite its proximity to such a violent fire. Forensics confirmed that the rifle had fired those casings, but the bullets themselves were never found. This was the first incident of its kind, but it was far from the last. On October 28, 2017, at 11:07 p.m. in Montana, dispatch received a call from a rancher who had spotted a woman in an old-fashioned black and white dress, wearing a linen cap. The rancher claimed the woman was standing motionless among his cattle. The rancher expressed no panic or concern for his safety over the phone, but rather seemed more concerned for the woman standing in the field. He also noted that his cattle were keeping their distance from her. An ambulance arrived at 11:29 p.m. Paramedics found no trace of the woman. They walked to the entrance of the rancher's house and discovered that the door was unlocked and open. After calling for the rancher and receiving no response, they stepped inside and were greeted by the sight of the rancher's corpse hanging from a noose in the stairwell. The man had no history of mental illness, and none of his relatives or acquaintances had any reason to believe he was suicidal. Additionally, an autopsy report concluded that both of his arms were broken in multiple places, as well as every finger, as if they had been crushed together by an immense force. It was clear he could not have tied the noose himself. On November 29, 2018, at 2:06 a.m. in Wisconsin, dispatch received a call from another farmer who had spotted a woman in an old black and white dress and linen cap. The woman had been standing motionless in the long driveway that led from the road to his house, illuminated by the lamp above it. She stood still in the cold, windy, and heavily snowing weather. The farmer and his wife were later found under a collapsed wall of their crumpled house, with stones placed on top of them. They had been arranged in a seemingly orderly fashion until there was enough weight to crush their bones. This happened to be the first incident on record with photographic evidence. A trail camera owned by the farmer and his wife, placed a few acres away from the house, captured a picture of the woman the night of the incident. The photo clearly showed the woman in the black and white dress, wearing a white linen cap. It appeared as though she had stepped through time from hundreds of years before and was frozen in place like a mannequin in front of the camera. I could go on, but the point is that these incidents have been happening more frequently, and they show no signs of stopping. We may not fully understand what they are, but we do know what they are supposed to represent to us. Every single one of these people lived in North America during the time of the witch trials. We do not believe they were the ones who were executed. Instead, we believe they were the ones who made the accusations, the ones who got their neighbors killed, the ones who carried out the executions. Now, they have returned to kill again. Fortunately, my department picked up on these patterns early and established a team to deal with them. There are a few hundred of us. I am in the dark about what everyone else does exactly. I haven't met many of my colleagues, but I do know that some find potential incidents, some investigate, some handle the cover-up and manage the publicity, and then, of course, there are those who are sent in to eradicate the problem. That's where I come in. I am here to hunt them down, to put them back in their graves, or so it would seem. Sometimes I arrive before they have claimed a victim, sometimes after. But their reign of terror always ends with me. They have never escaped me, and I have never failed an assignment. I didn't expect this night to be any different. A beep sounded from my laptop screen, signaling that one of the cameras had been triggered by movement. It had been quiet since I set the system up. There had not even been the slightest sign of wildlife. No deer, no squirrels, nothing. I leaned forward and intently examined the camera that had been triggered. There was nothing to see. Another sensor triggered. Again, the camera showed no movement. My eyes darted from camera to camera, scanning for any sign of motion. Another camera triggered, but all I could see was a shaking tree branch. There was no wind today. Another one. This time, I saw it. A dog-like figure darted across the camera in just a few frames, but I knew it was no dog. I quickly turned my attention from the cameras to the field in front of me, where the movement had come from. I positioned myself behind my rifle and peered down the scope toward the tree in the distance. My heart began to pound in my chest at an intense pace. I could feel the adrenaline kicking in as I scanned the edge of the field for any sign of movement. All I saw was the orange glint of the setting sun reflecting off the tree and the small shadows of the stumps of corn stalks in the otherwise empty field. It was silent. Not even a breeze accompanied the evening, though I couldn't complain. It was better for shooting. For a few minutes, I continued to move my scope along the tree, occasionally peeking with my own eyes. It was during one of these peeks that I noticed a color out of place between a couple of trees on the other side of the field, some sort of black and white speck that hadn't been there just a moment before. I lowered my head, returned to the scope, and centered it. As I steadied the scope, a man-like figure standing at the edge of the field came into focus. It wore black, tattered rags of clothing that hung loosely on its rigid frame. It stood motionless, stiff as a board. Its eyes were locked on something ahead of it. It took me a moment to realize it was focused on me. It did not move a muscle, not even to blink, as it stared at me. I snapped back into focus and prepared to do my job. I flicked the safety off my rifle and centered my crosshairs on its chest. I began to breathe deeply, my finger resting on the trigger, ready to pull, but I didn't take the shot, not yet. I saw it start to move. Even with the distance between us, my scope made the figure crystal clear. The movement came from only one part of its body, its mouth. First, its crusty lips detached from each other, and the mouth began to open. Steadily, it continued to open wider and wider, all the while the rest of its body and head remained fixed in place. Its jaw stretched, dropping lower than what should have been physically possible, but it didn't stop. It sank further, going below its chest, its skin stretching like a rubber band on the verge of snapping. Yet it didn't. It kept stretching, still as rigid as a board. The man-like creature remained, its eyes locked on me while its mouth hung open, impossibly wide. It stood there, motionless, with its jaw suspended for a moment I should not have given it. Now, I knew I had my target. I began to apply pressure to the trigger, but then I was stopped, shaken by a force. A scream erupted, one that sounded like a choir of souls in despair being dragged off to hell, with the power of 1,000 horns heralding the start of a medieval battle. The sound rang through the fields. Its volume caused flocks of birds in the nearby trees to fly away in panic, and the bass reverberated through my chest, leaving me too stunned to pull the trigger. I'll never get used to hearing one of them scream. "Here we go," I muttered to myself, the only thought my brain could conjure at that moment. Closing its mouth, the creature leapt forward, reaching for the ground in front of it with hands that had become fixed like claws. As soon as its hands touched the ground, its feet followed and planted themselves quickly, enabling it to propel itself forward once more. It had begun its terrifying charge. Throughout the entire motion, its face remained fixed on me, its rotting teeth exposed and clenched in rage. The speed at which it rushed across the empty field would make a deer fleeing for its life look lazy in comparison. But in this moment, I was the prey. Though my heart began to race at the sight of this abomination barreling toward me, an anomaly of hatred and hunger bound to flesh, I remained calm. I began to steady my breathing, taking control of each breath in and out. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, squeeze. The crack of the shot echoed through the dimming sky and the field before me, my response to its enraged scream. I remained fixed on the target, watching the spatter of blood as it shot from its back. The creature screamed again, but this time it was desperate and rapid in tone. I quickly moved the bolt and chambered the next round, accompanied by the soft ringing of the brass bouncing off the floorboards beneath my chair. Although I managed to land a clean shot to the chest, it did little to stop it. The creature kept running, maintaining the same speed. Now, it changed its direction, running adjacent to my position in the house. It was trying to flank me. It wanted to find a way around my line of sight. I couldn't let it. Once again, I took control of my breathing. Slowly, I adjusted my rifle on the bipod, ensuring the creature came back into view. Its limbs pounded the ground with an unrelenting speed and power as it propelled itself across the field. I will never get used to seeing one of them run. Starting behind it, I continued to move the scope just fast enough to start gaining on it, just fast enough to allow the crosshairs to catch up. Inhale, exhale. The crosshairs slowly began to overtake it. Inhale, exhale, squeeze. I quickly chambered the next round. The shot brought the creature to the ground, but it didn't stay there. After a brief tumble, it rose and began running again, this time back toward the woods from which it had emerged. Inhale, exhale, squeeze. The third shot grazed its back. Frustrated, I chambered another round and aimed, but it was too late. Before I could even begin to line up my fourth shot, it made one final leap from the field, disappearing back into the tree line it had come from. I let out a sigh and lowered my head in disappointment. I knew what I had to do next, but I certainly didn't want to. The last flickers of sunlight streamed through the open window, lighting up my .338 rifle as I reloaded the magazine. I sat there, staring blankly at the screen in front of me, hoping one of the cameras would pick up some movement that could clue me into where it had run off to. Knowing my luck, I shouldn't have expected anything. After coming to terms with the situation, I stood up, grabbed my .556 rifle, and slung it around. My body tensed as I let my rifle hang in front of me, adjusting its weight and aiming it downward, testing its sight and checking the laser before inspecting the chamber. It was ready to go. Next, I adjusted the night vision set to my head before grabbing my .338 rifle and heading for the door. As I stepped outside, I let out a deep sigh, this one full of stress. Hunting these creatures at night, on their own turf, is never as easy or enjoyable as quickly finishing them off from a distance. But what choice did I have? I just wanted to get it over with. I lowered my goggles and activated them, flooding the dark field with a green and white glow. I began my slow, cautious walk across the terrain. It took longer than I expected. The speed of that creature had made me underestimate the size of the field. Each step I took was deliberate and quiet. I didn't want the sound of my feet crunching against the dirt and remnants of corn stalks to disturb my hearing. If that thing made a sound, I needed to hear it. If only I could have silenced my incessant, heavy breathing. I wasn't even halfway to the treeline when I came across the first pool of blood, the place where I shot it the second time, forcing it to retreat. Bits of flesh were scattered around, but I didn't pause to inspect them. Instead, I focused on the blood trail, which led back into the woods. Any experienced hunter has had to track a deer or two. It can be a frustrating task. The trail isn't always clear, and you never know how far the prey has gone. In my case, I knew this creature was still alive, and I knew it was angry. I continued my walk, splitting my attention between the blood trail beneath me and the treeline ahead, scanning for any sign of movement and listening intently. If I was lucky, it would have become bold and attempted to take me down in the field. Unfortunately, I wasn't that lucky. Silently, I followed the trail until it led me to the edge of the woods. I stopped and calmed myself. I didn't want to go past those trees, but there was no avoiding it. I had a job to do. I extended the bipod of my .338 and lowered it to the ground, then raised the stock of my other rifle to my shoulder. I took a deep breath and resumed my walk, now moving even slower and more cautiously. At least now my heavy breathing was masked by the sound of twigs snapping underfoot. As soon as I entered the woods, I noticed the next trace of blood. It came from a tree branch, its leaves covered in dripping crimson. I approached to examine it, only to spot more blood on a higher branch. And then the next one. I began to notice the pattern, and followed each branch upward, one by one, each with its leaves stained with blood. Suddenly, a mass moved above me, atop the tree I was observing. I swung my rifle up, aiming above me at the tops of the trees. The mass shifted, and then two glowing eyes appeared, like bright lights through my night vision. It opened its mouth and let out another deafening scream, but I raised my rifle, took aim, and fired. Its scream was abruptly cut short by the bang of my barrel and the thud of rounds meeting flesh. I only managed to squeeze off half a dozen shots before it leapt away, scaling the neighboring trees. I kept firing as it jumped from one tree to another, but within seconds, it was out of my line of sight. I charged through the woods after it, watching as it leapt incredible distances, shaking the trees so violently that I feared some might snap. All the while, I kept trying and failing to line up a clean shot. Even as I sustained a full sprint for several minutes, I could barely keep up. I almost gave up the chase entirely before I saw an opportunity. Ahead, there was a clearing, a trail. The distance was too wide for it to jump. Realizing this, the creature took a sharp right and began leaping from tree to tree along the edge. I rushed into the clearing and immediately dropped to one knee, lining up a shot. I tracked the creature with my sights, timing each leap, letting it land and leap again before it settled onto a new tree. As it prepared to leap once more, I fired off 2 rounds. The shots were perfectly placed. Its body tumbled in the air and crashed violently to the ground. I lined up the sight again, squeezed the trigger, but instead of the expected gunshot, I heard the click of the firing pin in the empty chamber. I screamed curses at myself as I quickly swapped out the magazines. By the time I looked back up, the creature's body was already gone. I pushed myself to my feet and continued down the trail at a jog, keeping my rifle at the ready. Frustration was starting to overtake me. I had put dozens of these creatures in the ground before. I didn't understand why this one was proving so difficult. As I approached a curve in the trail, I slowed my pace and brought the stock of my rifle back to my shoulder. I took a wider approach to the curve, try and get a better view of what lay ahead, when my head violently snapped to the left. My vision went dark, and it took me a moment to realize that I wasn't dead nor unconscious. Something had hit my night vision goggles and knocked them off my head, breaking the mount they were secured to. My eyes were still adjusting to the darkness when another object came hurtling toward me, narrowly missing my head and whistling past my ear. It was a rock about the size of a football. I couldn't help but glance behind me in astonishment at the object that had nearly decapitated me. Then I turned my attention back to where it had come from. Sure enough, there it was, standing behind the trees at the corner of the path. My anger took over, and I began to fire rapidly at its torso. At this range, my disregard for accuracy didn't matter. Unfortunately, it also meant I was much closer than I would have liked, and the creature began to charge. I landed shot after shot. Blood erupted from its back, splattering the tree branches and leaves in its path as it barreled toward me. Once again, my magazine ran dry. Rather than wasting time reloading, I drew my Glock and continued firing at the beast with rapid precision. It broke into the clearing, dropping to all fours before leaping forward, closing the distance between us in mere seconds. A massive hand clamped around my throat, and I was lifted off the ground as if I weighed nothing. It kept running, carrying me past the edge of the clearing and into the woods. I kept firing at point-blank range with my pistol. Between shots, I could hear its hysterical laughter, mocking my futile attempts to stop it. Its face twisted into a grin filled with sadistic insanity. I kept shooting until my magazine went dry, and I was left holding an empty gun. With no other option, I began to beat its face with the empty pistol. This seemed to enrage it. It violently threw me through the air. My body snapped dozens of branches as I was hurled before hitting the ground and rolling uncontrollably. Recovering quickly, I grabbed the rifle still slung over my shoulder and replaced the empty magazine with a new one. It was mere feet away when I began to fire. I managed to get a few shots off before it grabbed my arm. In a panic, I swung the barrel of my rifle up and clubbed it hard across the face. It let out a short, irritated scream. I thrust the barrel at the top of its head, knocking it back as it emitted another angry grunt. It reached up with its left arm, attempting to grab the barrel, but half of its fingers. The creature's hand recoiled in pain as my shot blew off part of its fingers. It staggered back before swinging its arm at me. The impact sent my rifle flying out of my hands, and the sling came undone from my body as the weapon was thrown far into the woods behind me. I tried to retreat, but it grabbed me with its right hand, along with what was left of its left hand, and once again, I was lifted off the ground. This time, it carried me only a short distance before slamming me into a tree. My back cracked as I was slammed against the bark, and the creature looked up at me, smiling once again. "We killed our sinners. We brought justice to our land," it growled. I ignored its foul speech and, summoning every ounce of strength, lifted my arm and punched it hard across the face. It had no effect. "You are all sinners, and you will die for your sins, just as they did," it hissed. I struggled again, pummeling its face with everything I could muster, but it was as if nothing was working. "Now go and burn in a lake of fire," it shouted before laughing, and I could hear a dozen sadistic voices all coming from its mouth. It opened its mouth, and once again, its jaws stretched impossibly wide. It lowered me until I was at eye level with it, moving its open mouth toward my head, shaking with rage. Its teeth were mere inches from my face, and its foul breath filled the air. With my left arm, I drew my knife and slashed it across the creature's chest before plunging it deep into its neck. I threw a punch with my right arm, finally making it stumble. The creature wound up its own punch and threw it at me with all its might. I barely managed to duck out of the way, narrowly avoiding its fist as it collided with the tree, smashing straight through it and splitting it in half. I seized the opportunity and drew my .357 revolver. The creature recovered quickly from its punch and faced me, pulling the knife from its neck. Blood poured out in waves as it slowly advanced toward me, clearly prepared to deliver its finishing blow. Its head shook in fury, more violently than ever before. Its mouth hung open to half its capacity, revealing rows of rotting human teeth. I raised my revolver, trying to steady my sights, but my hands were shaky. I quickly collected myself. Inhale, exhale, the front sight aligned with the rear. Squeeze. The recoil of the shot made the gun rise slightly, but I managed to see the damage. I had clipped its mouth, striking the corner of its jaw. The side of its jaw detached completely, hanging loose as it wailed in pain. It gargled its own blood before crumbling to the ground. I aimed again, cocked the hammer, and squeezed the trigger. This time, the shot completely detached its jaw. "Let's see you bite me now," I muttered bitterly, my anger boiling. It dropped my knife and was now lying flat on its back, breathing heavily. I approached it, cocking the revolver again. The creature reached out with its mangled hand, but I kicked it away before pressing the barrel of my revolver to its skull. Squeeze. Then there was silence. After dragging the body back to the field, I spent the next few hours retrieving my lost and damaged equipment, carefully locating every one of my cameras. I then retrieved my vehicle and drove it to the edge of the field. There was just one more thing left to do. I opened the trunk and pulled out the heavy metallic box. I never understood why they made these things so damn heavy. I opened it and placed the creature's corpse inside before securing the heavy-duty lock. Next, I began digging the hole. It wasn't easy, not after being roughed up and thrown around by a superhuman, undead religious maniac. But this was the last thing I needed to do. After I finished digging, I placed a metal casket inside and covered it up. With that, I gathered my equipment, packed everything up, and left the area. Supposedly, a cleanup crew comes in after we finish these missions and destroys any strange evidence. I suspect they take the body as well. Where do they take it? What do they do with it? I have no clue, but I've been strictly reminded to avoid asking questions and just focus on doing my job. Still, I can't help but wonder. What I have even more questions about is why these creatures exist in the first place. What the hell is going on? Why them? Why now? Has this been going on longer than I know? Am I being lied to? What happens next if this continues? It's only been getting worse. They're showing up more and more frequently. When does it end? Does it end? I have more questions than answers, but what I can tell you is this. This problem is not going away anytime soon. It's only going to get worse. There will only be more of them, not fewer. The death toll will continue to rise. People will find out eventually. It might as well be now. Maybe we'll stop them. Maybe this will all come to an end one day. Or maybe we are the ones who will meet our end. Either way, I'll be there to see it.